Here upon this desolate spot, which perhaps never experienced the labours of the industrious husbandman, the eye of reflection sees stand uninterrupted a number of simple sepulchres of departed souls, whether of warriors, priests, or kings, it matters not. Their names have long been buried with their persons in the dust of oblivion, and their memories have perished with their mouldering urns.
Hi, survived the jive here. I'm on Exmoor in southwestern Britain, and I'm at a huge ridge overlooking a wide landscape, and at the top of this ridge there's a silhouette of 5 large barrows. But actually that's what's given it its name of 5 Barrows, this place. There are actually 9 barrows here, but some of them aren't so visible. You can see 2 or 3 just there, and I'm actually sitting on one of them now. This is one of the larger ones. Now these barrows represent the earliest indo-european culture in northwestern Europe. That is the Beaker culture, which arrived in Britain 4,500 years ago and dominated this area in the late Neolithic and the Bronze Age. And these barrows probably date from somewhere between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. It's hard to date them exactly, but based on the burial types within them, the cremation urns and stuff, we know that they're of the Beaker culture, so we can date them to that rough period. And one of these barrows is actually a type of barrow called a bell barrow, which is associated with the Beaker burials of Wessex. So that's in southeastern England or southern England proper, and so we can see it spread out here this far west. So these people were proto-Celts. They weren't Celtic language speakers, but they were probably the ancestors of the Celts of Britain. Well, they definitely were. They're the ancestors of all British people today. People have always looked at these barrows with a little sense of foreboding, a little bit wary. They're mysterious. Some, witchcraft has always been practiced here, even in the early modern period, and perhaps even today. There is a witchcraft museum not that far away in Boscastle in Cornwall, and I've seen some evidence of chopped up toads on these barrows today, which indicates there could have been some kind of witchcraft even now. There is an interesting phenomenon that this area is where there's Exmoor Ponies, and the Exmoor Ponies are thought to be an ancient breed of horse, but they might not be as old as people say. The oldest horses that enter Britain came around the same time as the Beaker people, and the first horses on Exmoor probably not that long after that. So, but we haven't actually looked at the DNA of any of those horses, the ancient horses here, so it's hard to say whether there's any genetic continuity between this wild horses of Exmoor, the Exmoor pony, and the original horses that came here. However, it's long been considered by local people and many others that the horse of Exmoor is a prehistoric breed, although the Professor Alan Outram, who's an expert on ancient horse DNA, he doesn't think that's very likely.
Horses in the British Isles became extinct at the end of the Ice Age, so they were hunted here as an animal that was a prey animal in the Ice Age. At the end of the Ice Age, there was no longer really a refugia in Britain appropriate for keeping a stock of wild horses. So as a result, they were introduced back into Britain after horses were domesticated elsewhere. They do start appearing in the Bronze Age, and it does seem highly likely that they were introduced with Beaker cultures from Europe, which do in fact contain a certain amount of Yamnaya ancestry. Not necessarily the horses, but the people. The horses yet need to be looked at. Yes, so the horse is reintroduced in the Bronze Age in that Beaker period. We do have some horse populations in Britain that are regarded as being very old ones, including the horses on Dartmoor and Exmoor that run wild today. Now, these are almost certainly feral horses. They're not truly wild horses that have existed there since time immemorial. But the question is, how old are they? When did they go feral? And when were they first introduced? I suppose it is vaguely possible that they could go all the way back to the Bronze Age, when those landscapes were very heavily settled and horses had been introduced, though I actually doubt that's the case. I suspect they're much more recent in origin than that, because that tends to be the trend we found when we examine these breeds that people think are exceptionally ancient. But I could be surprised. It could still turn out. I haven't seen the results in relation to Dartmoor ones yet, but it will be interesting to see just how old that particular breed is.
One of the ways we can identify these as bell beaker is the fact that the burial position, bell beaker culture, the first load of bell beaker people who came in from the Rhineland, they used to bury their dead like this, quite unusual. And that's found then in Scotland, England, out here in the West, and you can tell it's all one culture. As far as I know, there's no DNA samples from the bell beaker people around here, but there's others from around all the British Isles, and they all have that same indo-european steppe signal. They got DNA from the steppes, from the Yamnaya, and haplogroups are often the same as the Yamnaya ones, R1b derived. This area, the Exmoor, was once a long time ago forest. I mean, a really long time ago, but it was cleared in the Neolithic, at least. Maybe older, maybe hunter-gatherers started chopping down trees so they could hunt more easily, as the Native Americans did. But by the Neolithic, it was settled and used for farming. But something happened that it wasn't used as much later on. There are evidence of Bronze Age settlements here from the indo-European peoples who moved in, but it's hard to find out exactly how many people lived here, because most of the roundhouses of the Beaker people were wood, and they're not very well preserved, so we can't tell how many. But sometimes we find they built a stone roundhouse over the wooden roundhouse, and then you can see the evidence of the wood beneath. So we know that there were people living here, but these stone roundhouses often didn't have any hearth. Now, it gets quite cold here in the winters, so there's no way people could have lived in them otherwise. So there is a theory that the Indo-Europeans, bell beaker people on Exmoor, practiced some kind of transhumance, where that they would have come here with their cattle maybe during the summer and lived here in the summer, and then taken them somewhere else for winter. But evidence shows that this area hasn't been permanently settled. In different parts of history, people have left Exmoor. They've stopped living here, and then they come back again later. I think in the Iron Age there was a long period of not very many people living here. People came back a bit in medieval times. Nowadays, a lot of it's just, it's a national park, so it's not many people living on it. But there's some farming can be done, but it's very wet. It's very even up here at the top of this ridge, the ground is sodden. It's not very good for growing stuff. You can keep sheep here. Lots of mushrooms grow here. In fact, even magic mushrooms I found today were growing on top of the barrows, which is interesting. One might speculate whether they always have grown on those barrows. Isn't it interesting how these barrows that are some 4,000 years old, perhaps, look so very like barrows in Sweden that I've seen that can be 3,000 years old, or even just 1,500 years old. The barrow culture of the corded ware people and the battle axe culture of Scandinavia, and even the culture of making barrows among the Anglo-Saxons and the Celts and the Norse peoples, derived from the same origin that the bell beaker barrow culture comes from. It comes from the Kurgans, from the steppes, and spread out here. This isn't the same kind of landscape as the Pontic-Caspian steppe. It's much more hilly, much more cold and windy and rainy. But you can see how it's similar in other ways. You could draw chariots across this landscape. You could have your horses galloping across it. You could imagine when they burn the big pyre of the dead, the grand men who were buried in here, whose barrows have stood here for these millennia. A testament to the victory of that culture over this land. And we are their legacy.
On the Exmoor there are over 300 barrows from the late Neolithic, to the early Bronze Age was mainly associated with the bell beaker culture. And this is a nice example of one from Brockenbarrow. It's called Brockenbarrow urn, but there are actually several barrows at the Brockenbarrow site, and there have been other urns unearthed from it before this one. It was unearthed at the beginning of the 20th century, and unfortunately there was a mishap involving a drunk individual which led to it being smashed. Perhaps it wasn't in great condition when it was first unearthed anyway, but it was restored to its present state in the 1990s, and you can see quite clearly where the reparations have been done. Unlike some bell beaker urns, this one is not decorated at all except for a single ridge around the centre. Sometimes it can be corded. This contained ashes and small bones, and that's precisely what the other barrow, the other urn removed from a barrow, Brockenbarrow on Exmoor, was said to have contained in the 1600s, when an unfortunate gentleman removed it with the hope that his fate would change and that he would uncover some great wealth within the barrow on his land. But a ghost story of the local area reveals that instead he came to an untimely end as a result of unearthing that barrow, which contained the ashes and bones of what appeared to be a child. So the majority of the barrows on Exmoor and in that area are presumed to be from roughly 1800 BC. The dating has to be based on what's taken out of the barrows, and this hasn't been specifically dated, but I can presume it's from that region of time anyway. They would need to examine the contents of the urn in order to ascertain that. But it's typical of the style that's associated with the Beaker people. Much like the barrows at Five Barrows, the same sort of style that came across from the Beaker invasions from the Rhine area in the late Neolithic. In this book, The Archaeology of Exmoor, by L.V. Grinsell, we have an excellent account from 1630 by Thomas Westcott, who describes what he heard had happened to the unfortunate labourer who discovered the barrow and its urn. A daily labouring man, by the work of his hand and sweat of his brow, having gotten a little money, was desirous to have a place to rest himself in old age, and therefore bestowed it on some acres of wasteland, and began to build a house thereon near, or not far from, one of these barrows, named Brockenbarrow, whence he fetched stones and earth to further his work. Having pierced into the bowels of the hillock, he found therein a little place, as it had been a large oven, fairly strongly and closely walled up, which comforted him much, hoping that some great good would befall him, and that there might be some treasure there hidden to maintain him more liberally and with less labour in his old years. Wherewith encouraged, he plies his work earnestly until he had broken a hole through this wall, in the cavity whereof he espied an earthen pot, which caused him to multiply his strokes, until he might make the orifice thereof large enough to take out the pot, which his earnest desire made not long a-doing. But, as he thrust in his arm and fastened his hand therein, he suddenly heard, or seemed to hear, the noise of the trampling or treading of horses coming, as he thought, towards him, which caused him to forbear and arise from the place, fearing the comers would take his purchase from him, for he assured himself it was treasure. But looking about every way to see what company this was, he saw neither horse nor man in view. To the pot again he goes, and had the like success a second time, and yet, looking all about, could ken nothing. At the third time he brings it away, and therein only a few ashes and bones, as if they had been of children, or the like. But the man, whether by fear, which yet he denied, or other cause, which I cannot comprehend. In very short time after, lost senses both of sight and hearing, and in less than 3 months he died.